everyone. Thank you for coming to join us for what I hope is going to be a really memorable experience for us all today. If you don't have your pizza and books yet and you want to grab them, please do. We're going to try to get going right on time today so that I know everybody has other obligations you need to get to. I'm Alan Culpepper. I am an English professor at Southeast Campus, and I'm one of the ones who worked on organizing this event. I want to say just a few super fast thank yous. I'm sure I'll miss people, but I need to make the effort. So in the English department, Pam Kennedy and Amy Raines have been working really hard on this. Whitney Hugh, the NBF representative, our friends here at the C4C, Anina Collier, Cindy Armstrong, John Niemeyer, the setup crew who makes things look wonderful, the marketing people for getting you all here, our student life, David Adams, John Herring, Hutch Hutchinson have all been very helpful, and our School of Liberal Arts and Communications staff, our dean, and staff have been very helpful, and we want to thank all of those people. What I'm going to do really fast is introduce a special guest, and then she is going to introduce our moderator, and we will go on from there. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you the Deputy Director of the National Book Foundation, Beth Harrison.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. As Alan mentioned, my name is Beth Harrison. I'm from the National Book Foundation. We're based in New York City. I am really terrifically excited to be here. This is my second time in Oklahoma, my first time in Tulsa. Beautiful city, and thank you for giving us such a warm welcome here. Today's program, Identity and Growing Up, will feature National Book Award honored authors Robin Benway and Dr. Brandon Hobson. I'd like to take a moment to also thank some people. There might be some repeats, but it's worth thanking people. Tulsa Community College's Metro Campus staff, particularly Amy Raines, Alan Culpepper, Pam Kennedy, Cindy Coker, for helping organize today's event, as well as Provost Dr. Greg Stone. I'd also like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for providing the funding to get our authors here today, and also to purchase the books that you received. So there are books at the back. I hope you got them. If you didn't, I see them. So you can have them signed after the event. As far as our program today, the authors are going to read for about 2 or 3 minutes, a passage from their books, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, as Alan mentioned, led by Dr. Stone. We'll also have 15 minutes or so of question and answers that you can ask the authors your burning questions, so please be thinking about those if you haven't already. Let's see, I was going to say that there are going to be light refreshments because I was told to say that, but you already know that because you've got pizza. I smelled it as soon as I walked in, so it smells good. Before I introduce the afternoon's participants more formally, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the National Book Foundation and what we do. Our mission is to celebrate the best literature in America, expand its audience, and ensure that books have a prominent place in American culture. We're best known for giving out the National Book Awards, which our 2 authors today have received. And we also present programs across the country year-round. They're education initiatives and public events. One of them that we're particularly proud of is called Book Rich Environments, and by the end of this summer, that program will have given out 1 million free books to children and families living in public housing communities in 20 states nationwide. We also produce things like Book Up, which is an after-school and summer reading intensive, kind of like a book club for middle school students, and it's in 5 states, and we're growing that every year. We're also going all out with expanding our public events like these through what we call NBF Presents, and we're bringing, again, National Book Award honored authors to libraries, book festivals, and of course, community colleges. Finally, this year we launched a program called Literature for Justice, which aims to contextualize and humanize the issue of mass incarceration in America through literature. So there's a 5-book reading list that we have selected through a committee and are promoting those around the country to try to get our handle on this issue. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We believe that books matter. We work year-round, every day at our office to make sure they continue to do so. So, without further ado, let's introduce the authors and moderator. Dr. Greg Stone will lead the discussion today. He's the provost of Tulsa Community College's Metro Campus. He previously served as an assistant professor of English from 2006 to 2014. He holds a PhD in English from the University of Tulsa, as well as graduate and undergraduate degrees in English from Northeastern State University. Robin Benway is the author of 6 novels for young adults, including Audrey Waite, the AKA series, and Emily and Oliver. Her books have received numerous awards and recognition, including the PEN America Literary Award, the Blue Ribbon Award from the Bulletin for the Center of Children's Books, the American Library Association's Best Book for Young Adults, and their popular paperbacks for young adults. In addition, Robin's novels have received starred reviews from Kirkus, Booklist, Publishers Weekly, and have been published in more than 25 countries. The book that you have here today, Far from the Tree, won the 2017 National Book Award for Young People's Literature. It also received the 2018 PEN America Award and was named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, PBS, Entertainment Weekly, and the Boston Globe. Robin grew up in Orange County, California, attended New York University and UCLA, and currently lives in Los Angeles. And Dr. Brandon Hobson is the author of, most recently, the novel Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award in Fiction and also longlisted for the 2019 Aspen Words Literary Prize. In addition, Brandon has won a Pushcart Prize, and his work has appeared in such publications as The Believer, Conjunctions, Noon, Publishers Weekly, the Paris Review Daily, and Post Road. He earned his PhD from Oklahoma State. He is also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Stone, who will not introduce because I introduced, but we'll begin the discussion with Robin and Brandon. Thank you so much.
Come on. Good afternoon, everybody. This is when you say good afternoon, right? You need to warm up because we have some questions that we want to hear from you later on. But I also want to thank, in addition to echoing the thanks that were given to our fantastic English department faculty and the staff of the School of Liberal Arts and Communication, want to recognize Dr. Tracy Skopek, who's Dean of Liberal Arts and Communication. She's here with us today. And also Dr. Cindy Hess, who's our Chief Academic Officer and Senior Vice President at Tulsa Community College. Thank you both for taking the time out of your schedules to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming as well. Beth, thank you so much for the introductions, and let's give it up for the National Book Foundation for the great work that they do. Because reading matters, and books matter, and ideas matter, and you're in for a great treat today to hear from both of our guests, Brandon Hobson and Robin Benway. Thank you both so much for taking the time to be here with us. Anybody go to the library discussion last night at Tulsa City County Library where they both appeared? Beth was there. I was in class, I couldn't go, but heard great things about it from a friend of mine who moderated that discussion. Let's start off just with a little bit of a reading. Both of our authors have agreed to give us a taste of their books. Many of you have them, so if you haven't read them yet, I know you're going to enjoy them. Robin, why don't we start with you, if you wouldn't mind, and maybe just sort of give us a little bit of context from where in the novel you want to read from, and then we'll go from there.
Perfect. Is this, everyone can hear me, I assume? Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I've never been to Oklahoma before. Hopefully the next time I'm here I can spend a little bit more than 23 hours in your beautiful state. So I am going to read from the very, very opening pages of Far from the Tree, so no spoilers, don't worry. But it is about 3 siblings, all of whom were placed for adoption as babies. They all have the same mother but different fathers, and they do not know about each other. And the book opens with 16-year-old Grace, who is the middle sibling. She herself is pregnant and has decided to place her own daughter for adoption. And in doing that, she suddenly feels this connection to her biological mother that she has never really felt before. She's never felt the need to go looking for her. And in looking for her mom, ends up finding her older brother Joaquin and her younger sister Maya. And the book is told from all 3 of their perspectives as they go looking for their family and start to figure out what it means to have siblings and be a sibling and the way that that really sort of impacts your life. So this is just from the very opening. This is from Grace's point of view. Grace hadn't really thought too much about homecoming. She knew that she'd go, though. She figured that she and her best friend would get dressed together, get their hair done together. She knew that her mom would try to be cool about it and not get excited, but she'd make Grace's dad charge the fancy, expensive camera, not the iPhone. And then Grace would take pictures with Max, her boyfriend. Grace thought like that about everything in her life. Homecoming was just something that she knew she'd do. She didn't question it. Which is why it was so surprising that she ended up spending homecoming night not in a fancy dress, not sipping out of Max's flask and dancing with Janie and taking cheesy photos, but in the maternity ward of St. Catherine's Hospital, her feet in stirrups instead of heels, giving birth to her daughter. It wasn't until Grace's favorite jeans were tighter during week 12, which she didn't realize was week 12 at the time, that she started to suspect that something was off. And it wasn't until week 13 that she made her boyfriend Max drive them 20 minutes away to a store where they wouldn't see anyone they knew so they could buy 2 pregnancy tests. It turned out that pregnancy tests were expensive. So expensive, in fact, that Max had to check his bank balance on his phone while they stood in line just to make sure that he had enough in his account. By the time Grace realized what had happened, she was in the 5th day of her 2nd trimester. The baby was the size of a peach. Grace looked it up on Google. The adoption lawyer sent over a huge folder of prospective families, each of them more eager-looking than the next. But no one was good enough for Peach. Not the prospective dad who resembled a hamster, or the mom whose haircut hadn't been updated since 1992. Grace nixed one family because their toddler looked like a biter, and another because they hadn't ever traveled east of Colorado. Never mind that Grace hadn't even traveled past Colorado, but Peach deserved better. She deserved more. She deserved mountain climbers, international voyagers, people who searched the world for the best things because that's what Peach was. Grace wanted intrepid explorers who mined for gold because they were about to strike it rich. Catalina was originally from Spain, and she was fluent in both Spanish and French. Daniel was a website designer who worked from home. He would be the stay-at-home parent during the first 3 months, which Grace thought was pretty badass. They had a Labrador retriever named Dolly, who looked both affectionate and stupid. Grace chose them. Peach was born at 9:03 p.m. on homecoming night, right when Max was being crowned homecoming king because, Grace thought bitterly, boys who get girls pregnant are heroes, and girls who get pregnant are sluts. Leave it to Peach to steal Max's thunder, though. The first thing Grace's daughter ever did, and it was genius. She was so proud. It was like Peach knew she was the heir to the throne and had arrived to claim her tiara. Peach came out of Grace like fire, like she had been set aflame. There was Pitocin and white-hot pain that seared Grace's spine and ribs and hips into rubble. Her mom held her hand and wiped her hair back from her sweaty forehead and didn't mind that Grace kept calling her mommy like she had when she was 4 years old. Peach twisted and shoved her way through Grace, like she knew that she was just a vessel for her and that her real parents were waiting outside, ready to take Peach home to her real life. Sometimes, when it was late at night and Grace let herself drift to that dark place in her brain, she thought that she would have been okay if only she hadn't held Peach, if she hadn't felt her skin and smelled the top of her head and seen that she had Max's nose and Grace's hair. But the nurse had asked Grace if she wanted to, and Grace ignored her mother's worried eyes, her lip caught between her teeth, and she reached out and took Peach from the nurse, and she didn't know how else to explain except to say that Peach fit. She fit into Grace's arms like she had fit beneath her rib cage, nestled there soft and safe. And even though Grace's body felt like soot and ashes, her head felt as if it had been washed clean for the first time in 10 months. Peach was perfect. Grace was not. And Peach deserved perfect.
Robin, thank you. Brandon, why don't you share with us from Where the Dead Sit Talking?
Sure. First, thanks to everybody for coming out. Just a little bit of background about this book. It's set in 1989 here in Oklahoma about a Native American foster teen staying in a foster home, and so I'm going to read just a couple of pages from the very beginning of the novel, toward the beginning of the novel. Looking back, I realize I wanted more than anything else to be liked, accepted. Moving from place to place, from shelter to foster home, almost always took its toll. And at 15, I'd never gotten over the crippling anxiety of sleeping in a new room, a new bed, living in a whole new environment. While the shelter was confining and supposed to be short-term placement, I'd grown to appreciate having my own room and how easy it was to manipulate the staff and sneak away at night. Foster homes were different. Foster homes were real families in real houses with burglar alarms and neighborhood watch groups. A teenager couldn't walk around in such a neighborhood late at night and get away with it. Agnes and Harold, the foster parents, told me how proud they were of George's donations and participation in the annual walkathon for leukemia, as well as his time spent volunteering at the local animal shelter and the public library, and that they thought other students should be as passionate and proactive about such issues as he was. Over the past summer, he'd done even more. His picture was in the newspaper for collecting used athletic shoes for the Perpetual Prosperity Pumps Foundation that raised awareness of poverty in Ghana or somewhere. Agnes was quoted in the paper as saying, "George has such a big heart." "We're proud of Rosemary's accomplishments too," she added, but didn't mention any of them. The first night was strange. It came upon me like a burning memory, how shadows spread across the wall in this new room. And in trying to sleep, I revisited all the other rooms where I had slept in my past. My room at the shelter, with its dull concrete walls, absent of life and color, with one small window facing the brick building next door. My room in our first house, a small house built of rock that sat near a hill in the woods, with the bedroom full of wallpaper of ships at sea, and the small closet I feared held the monsters that lived there, creatures that crawled up from the dirt below the house, who howled in the night, whose shadows cast jagged shards of light across the ceiling when I tried to sleep. My room in the small apartment above the dirty bookstore where I slept with a blanket the spirits had blessed with protection. I was more afraid there than anywhere. I heard sirens and traffic sounds at night. There were voices from the street outside. The room was the smallest room I've ever seen, as I now recall. And my mother's footsteps on the hardwood floors kept me awake until late in the night. My room in the foster home after my mother was locked up the first time, a room I shared with two other boys who slept in bunk beds. I slept on a trundle bed against the wall across from the window. The room was never frightening like some of the other rooms, though the boy on the top bunk thought it was, and he spent many nights crying himself to sleep. And into this new room I was now thrown, or so it seemed, trying to sleep again. This room with its clock ticking on the wall by the door, with its shadows and lights stretching across the wall and ceiling. And I remember how that first night in bed, I could hear George making sounds of explosions and gunfire with his mouth. It was something a younger boy might do while playing Army. In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling and waited for him to stop. After it went on a while, I finally sat up in bed and looked over at him. "I'm trying to sleep," I said. "I forgot you were here," he said. "I'm right here." I lay in the bed with my arm over my eyes, trying to go to sleep. I felt a sadness, but also a kind of confusion. There was nothing I was afraid of, and nothing to look forward to, which made me want to leave. And I'll stop there.
So let me start off by asking both of you, and Brandon, maybe we can start with you, this question. What inspired you to tell these particular stories? I mean, do you recall that first sort of clear image or germ of an idea that led you on the path to writing these novels and telling these stories?
Well, with this particular novel, it came out of an inspiration. It was inspired from working with youth in foster care, deprived youth, delinquent youth, although I don't really like that word, delinquent. But I was in social work for 7 years, from 99 to 2006. as I worked with a large number of kids, some of whom were locked up, some of whom were just in foster placement, and I began to listen to their stories, and I heard their voice. And Sequoia, in this novel, grew out of that experience from social work. So I knew Sequoia's voice. It was being a sort of culmination, and I knew that I wanted the harsh realities of things like abuse, writing about abuse, about homelessness, about substance abuse, all these issues that I think are very much out there and with kids. And so I wanted to present this story of Sequoia, but also there are some identity issues too that maybe we'll talk about for his identity. So,
Robin, what about you? Where did the story come from?
From a Costco, literally. What happened was I was working, this is my 6th book. I had written 5 so far, and I had a book that I owed to my publisher. It ended up being a year and a half late. I don't recommend being a year and a half late to your publisher if you ever are in that experience. I was just really struggling to find an idea that would click. I was writing 10, 15, 20,000 words, and it would just peter out. And even my agent was like, this is really boring. And I was like, yeah, I agree. I don't even want to read this book. And I kind of felt like I've had a really wonderful 10-year run of writing books. I've been so fortunate, and I kind of thought, okay, the game is over. I better figure out what else I'm going to do. How am I going to support myself now? I was sending out resumes. I started a small business with a friend of mine. I just saw my career ending, and it felt like a breakup. It felt like the worst breakup of my life. I love writing so much, and to feel it slip away was just heart-wrenching. And I sent a letter to my editor, an email, and I just said, I'm sorry, I don't have a book for you, and I don't know when I'm going to have a book for you. And she was lovely and patient and just said, we know you have something, and we'll wait. Don't worry. And I was like, well, I'm glad someone's not worried, because I'm very worried. And I was waiting for my mom one time. I was visiting my mom. We were at Costco, and I was sitting in the car with the radio on, and there was a Florence and the Machine song, and it's Cosmic Love, if you've ever heard it. And the opening line is, a falling star fell from your heart and landed in my eye. And it just, and I don't know why, if you're a writer or a creative person, you just all of a sudden sometimes get like this idea in your head, and it just sparks this whole book. And that's exactly what happened for me. It made me think of a biological mother maybe having a child, placing that child for adoption, and hoping that that child carries her love, even though that child might not ever know her or see her again. And I just immediately knew Maya and Grace and Joaquin. And in the car, while the song's still playing, I tapped out an email to my editor, and I was like, remember last week when I said my career's over? Guess what? I have an idea. And that's how it all began. And it took a much longer time to figure out how to tell all 3 of their stories, and there were a lot of stops and starts, but that's how it began. And my mom came back from Costco and got in the car, and I was like, good news, I thought of an idea. And she's like, 20 minutes ago, you were convinced your career was over, and now you have an idea. And that's really where it came from. I wish I had a much more organic story, but it was really just that first line of the song.
Excellent.
We tried to put it in the epigraph of the book, but it's very expensive to quote Florence and the Machine in your book.
Well, it's a great reminder to all of us in the room, students who are writing college essays, right? You've never arrived as a writer so that you never have problems, right? It's a great story to tell, so thank you for sharing that story. And congratulations for going to Costco.
Thank you.
That's great.
Love Costco.
It's a good plug for Costco. I do want to talk about identity, because creating identity, recognizing identity, it's such an important part of both of your novels. And you both write about the foster care system and about adoption, and I'm wondering what is it about that system for you that makes this such fertile ground for stories, particularly for young adults, if we want to classify these as young adult novels. Robin, for you, how did you get there, and why was it important that you wrote about adoption and that whole system for these characters?
For me, the 3 siblings, Maya and Grace, are both Caucasian, and they were adopted at birth in a private adoption and have been with their adoptive parents. And for Joaquin in the book, he is Mexican-American. His father is Mexican. And he obviously does not know either one of his parents or his siblings, and he winds up in foster care. And I realized that I wanted to tell that aspect of the story because I didn't want to whitewash the adoption experience. I really wanted to talk about what race looks like within the foster care system and the adoption care. One of the first things when I first started researching Far From the Tree and looking at adoption was a story in NPR, and it talked about how much it costs to privately adopt a baby, a newborn baby, and a baby white girl is $10,000 more than, let's say, an African American newborn boy, and that. I'm not naive, and I know why, but at the same time, it blew my mind to see a dollar amount attached to a child in that manner. And I thought, if I'm going to tell the story, I really want to tell the story. And I also wanted to talk about who winds up in foster care. You know, kids of color are taken out of their homes at a much higher rate than Caucasian children are, and who stays in foster care. You know, these boys become 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, and suddenly they're men, and they look like men, and they don't have a chance at being adopted the way maybe younger children were. And that is exactly what happens to Joaquin. He just sort of tumbles through the system, and yet is still trying to figure out who he is as Joaquin, as a person, as Mexican American. And it's very hard to do because he doesn't have a foundation. And in meeting his sisters, that's what starts to provide him with that foundation. You know, someone else who says, I don't look like you, but I am part of you.
And Brandon, in your novel as well, Sequoia is not only, aware of his native heritage and how that's a part of his identity, but he also is experiencing a different kind of sexual identity, right, as he matures and
Sure.
wearing eyeliner at school and those things. Talk about that
Yeah,
experience for you.
and I think, that was, part of my interest in writing about Sequoia was his sort of confusion of, asking that question, what is my identity, and wearing eyeliner, interested in, jewelry and that. The question of gender, right, which I think we're just now beginning to talk about in 2019, or the past few years, right, that we're maybe feeling a lot more comfortable talking about gender issues, whereas certainly in 1989, if here in Oklahoma, was not talked about very much, right, or it certainly was I still, even in 2019, I don't know that we're where we need to be yet in terms of being comfortable about talking about these things and letting people express themselves how they want to express themselves through dress or in whatever way, and so that was part of, like most teenagers, having that big question of what is my identity. And with Sequoia not being full Cherokee, he was kind of asking himself, am I, going in shelter and I'm around, a lot of non-native other kids that, see me as something other than white, but then at the same time, native kids are seeing him as not necessarily native. So that question of his race and as well as gender is certainly a big part of his character, and wanting to, I thought it's really not explored much in fiction, and particularly through a man looking back. I mean, again, this book is told from the voice of a man looking back at a short time when he was 14, 15 years old. So it becomes not necessarily a youthful voice, right? But certainly an unreliable one, maybe, because it's told from an older man's perspective, which is not always, reliable, I think.
Right,
So.
and it seems to me that there's also something to be said about, to your point, the role of memory, whether it's reliable or not, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
In terms of shaping our identity or recognizing that. Maybe you could both talk, Brandon, maybe you start about the role that memories of these characters play and how they form their identity, and whether that's
right.
how reliable memory is.
Yeah,
right,
and
I
I think when we were talking about this yesterday, this isn't necessarily for a young adult audience, and part of that reason I think is because it is told from a man's point of view, looking back and not really holding back on certain, to be abrupt about certain things, but at the same time, he is withholding information from us. So, one of the big questions that a lot of people ask me is about ambiguity in a story. If something is ambiguous, why, right? You're not telling us everything. why aren't you telling us everything, every specific detail? And Sequoia doesn't do that necessarily. That's something I'm interested in as a reader, because I often come away after having read something, I notice that the questions are not necessarily what was given to us, but what was not given to us, if that makes sense. In other words, why do you think that this character did this? Because she doesn't tell us, or he doesn't tell us, but yet they do this. And so those discussions, will often lead to, what's being hidden, what's underneath the surface, what's not being directly told to us, right? So it's implied, and that's part of the narration, I think, from an older narrator looking back, purposefully hiding certain details. Whereas if Sequoia were telling this at 15 years old, he would probably be a lot more honest about certain things, right? So it's kind of tricky, I think, with narrators.
And Robin, your characters have a lot of secrets as well, right?
They do.
Many secrets.
They do. One of the things that I first kind of realized when I started working on this book and writing it from three perspectives is I thought everybody has to have a secret. And, when you meet someone for the first time, you're putting your best foot forward. You don't want them to know all sort of these dirty little secrets that make up your life. And with these siblings, I wanted them all to sort of put their best foot forward with each other. And, of course, it all falls apart dramatically because plot, it has to move forward. And so for Joaquin, there's a big theme, and I didn't even realize it until the book was done, but there's a big theme about baby photos and who hangs on to your baby photos. And for Joaquin, growing up in foster care, no one's bought his school photos over the year. He doesn't have baby photos of himself. He doesn't have these memories the way I feel like a photo is almost a tangible reminder of a memory. And, even though your memory is so subjective, here's proof of what happened. And for Maya, the youngest sibling, her whole family, she was adopted privately at birth. Her parents got pregnant right after she was adopted. They're all redheads, and she is brunette. So there is a whole wall of family photos throughout the year. And, for her family, it's this wonderful reminder of everything that they've done and all the vacations they've taken. But for her, all she sees is the odd man out in every single photo. It's very easy to tell which child was adopted and which one was not. And it makes her feel very uncomfortable. And she isn't sure how to express that. And Grace has going back to the secret of her pregnancy. She's been this model 16-year-old, and she doesn't know how to talk about this grief and this pain that she's feeling without giving up so many of her vulnerabilities. And I think having the siblings come together and start to reveal one another's secret is what brings them together. And that's, I think what sort of makes your family is the accepting of the more negative sides of your personality or the darker parts of your life, and being able to talk about those things with each other.
Well, and to that point, the characters in both of your novels build their own families, right? And so I'm wondering if that was something intentional that you went into these books wanting to talk about. Have you had that experience yourself? As I read both of these novels, I thought about that a lot. I'm close with my biological family, I know them, but I also have a family that I've built of really close friends, and that relationship is just as important as the biological one. Robin, was that something you intended?
Absolutely.
As you went into the story?
Kind of what we were speaking about earlier about talking about things in the modern world in 2019, it's very important to me to talk about that all families are valid, regardless of what they look like, regardless of who the parents are, who the children are. I think found families are as important as biological families. I think sometimes they save you in ways that your biological family can't. I know for me, there are people I would die for, and some I'm related to, and some I'm not. And I think it's so important to talk about, again, within the pages of this book, I wanted to show that adopted, biological, foster care, therapist relationship, friends, siblings that you meet 20 years after you're born, as long as you can find like a safety and a comfort with them and know that they have your back, that's to me what matters. And it's about cutting off the people who do not provide that for you and going to look for the people that do.
Brendan, what about you? I can imagine your time working in the social services system, you had to have had that experience as well from time to time, and certainly seen it.
Yeah. So working, the idea of family was always a question, right? Excuse me. The idea of who is my family, that I think a lot of kids might ask, especially in foster care, right? Is this my family? For good? Is it temporary? Because there's temporary foster placement, right? And so, that question has always been very strong. That I've thought about. And for Sequoia in this book, there's a Kiowa girl named Rosemary who he immediately develops a bond with, and it's on this whole other level that, at least from what he's telling us, right, feels almost spiritual, that like they can almost communicate, right, on some other level. And so he immediately feels that spiritual bond with them being the only natives in the foster home. So the idea of almost like, I think at some point he says he sees her as a sister, so much so that he becomes very, very fascinated with her, that wanting to look like her, right? Wanting to, very, very heavily influenced by the way she dresses, the way she talks. And again, those sort of come back to the idea of his own, struggling with his own gender identity, but yeah, that idea of family right away from his mother is locked up, by the way, for non-violent crime. She's locked up for substance abuse, which in Oklahoma seems to be has been a pattern for people being locked up for non-violent crimes, right? Which seems to be a problem to me. And so part of it was that. Look at what comes out of that. Was mother was locked up. Maybe she should have been in a rehabilitation center. All right. So that I've always felt strongly about as well.
Be thinking of questions, because in just a couple of minutes we're going to pass the microphone around, and I know many of you probably have questions. I have just a couple more. Robin, what were your favorite books growing up when you were a teenager, young adult? I'm always fascinated by what writers read and how they've been influenced by what they've read. So what were some of your favorites when you were, in your late teens or early 20s? For all of us, that was just like 5 years ago. Yeah. Right? So just be clear about that.
I actually feel like I have to go back even further, because especially now writing young adult literature and the immediacy that requires, that feeling of this is happening right now and this is the only thing that matters. For me, the books that mattered the most were Judy Blume, Beverly Cleary, and The Babysitter's Club. And I didn't realize until just a few years ago how much those books have influenced my own writing. And it was girls trying to figure stuff out, and messing it up terribly. Ramona did everything wrong in all those books. I just feel like also those authors, Anna Martin and Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume, they were so prolific, and they wrote so many books, and they did it so well. And just for me, as now an author, I just want to keep being able to do that. I want to be able to keep writing good books that people enjoy reading, and to be able to do it for a long time. But I talked a little bit about it last night, but my dad used to always say to me, "Why aren't you reading the classics?" I was like 10, and he's like, "You should be reading the classics." And my dad never read the classics, but he wanted me to read them. And we got into a huge fight because he bought me a copy of The Hobbit, and the cover scared me because The Hobbit looked scary, and I didn't want to read it. All I wanted to do was read The Babysitter's Club, go to ride my bike to the Walden Books at the mall and buy the new copy every month, the next episode. And what I realized later was that my dad, of course, could not understand that at 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, that's when your friendships really start to fall apart, and suddenly your best friend is your worst enemy, and you don't know what happened, and it's just war. It's absolute war in 7th grade. And reading The Babysitter's Club was a reminder that, you can still be friends. These girls would fight and make up, and they were friends in every single book. And it was such a comfort to me reading those books and seeing things work out in fiction. And I think if I can provide that sort of comfort or a certain enjoyment now for readers, especially younger readers, that would just be the ultimate goal, I think.
Brandon, what books shaped your identity?
One of the first books, of course, is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton here, and part of that is, being Oklahomans are, handed that book, and that was a very important book to me. I want to say one of my first memories, I have a very early memory of my mom taking me to the library and picking out Amelia Bedelia books, right? And really, really, really loving those books when I was little. I don't know if that shaped my identity or anything, but it's a really, really nice memory I have of a library and of reading, that of just sort of picking out those books. But I started reading J.D. Salinger. I really liked all of J.D. Salinger's stuff. And also Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man was an early book that I it's collected stories about, they're sort of sci-fi, Ray Bradbury, right? But that when I was, not really till college, I didn't read much. I'll just say that I wasn't a great student, but when I got to college, I took an introduction to literature class, and that was a class that really opened my eyes to, wow, I really do. We were reading some really great poetry. I really love reading poetry. I don't write it, but I love reading it, and that really, kind of a late bloomer, I think, because that didn't. If you would have asked me in high school if I would have wanted to get a PhD in English, I would have, fallen out of my chair or something probably. But I mean, from being asleep, right? Because I was, but yeah, so those are just a few of the books I think that shaped me as a writer.
Well, and thank you for that plug for Introduction to Literature, which will be on a summer and fall schedule coming soon.
That's right.
To a schedule near you. Wow. American Lit, British Lit Survey, also good choices. Humanities credit, check it out, good stuff. Recruit where you can, Dr. Hess, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Fantastic class.
Right. No doubt there are some aspiring writers in the room. And so as we get ready to hear some questions from them, let me ask both of you, Brandon, maybe you can start. What advice do you have for aspiring writers, whether they're poets or fiction writers or creative nonfiction writers in the room?
Well, a couple of things. I think first of all is read as widely as you can, and never feel like it's too late to start. I started later. But read as widely as you can. Don't be in a huge hurry to try to get stuff published. The biggest mistake that I have made, and might sometimes still before I give something to my agent, is it in the best possible shape that I can make it? And that means staying with it and revising it, and having a community of friends or readers just to be real honest with you about questions, and developing that habit of continuing to work on it and being very, very patient, right? Again, I think if you do that, the publishing stuff will eventually come. But it's really, really hard to be patient. But it's ultimately a huge, huge payoff, if you are.
Robin, what's your advice?
I would say learning to finish something is very important. I did not finish anything until my first book was published, and that's because I was contractually obligated to finish this book and give that to them. It's so easy to, you have a shiny new idea and you write, you're so excited, and then you get to the middle, and the middle is the worst part, and it's a mess, and you don't know what you're doing. Learning to wade through that muck and come out the other side, and then going back and editing this cohesive piece is one of the hardest things to do as a writer. I've written 6 books. I'm working on book 7 right now. I hate the middle. I still hate the middle. And so I think if you can learn how to do that, and also being very kind to yourself while you're doing that, learning to be able to say to yourself, today wasn't a good day. And I'm still learning how to take my own advice, so I'll be honest with you. But being able to say, I'm going to come back to it tomorrow. I'm going to start over tomorrow. There is no end to it. You're never suddenly like, oh, I'm a writer. I figured it out. No, you don't. Every book is new, every single time. And so I'd say be really kind to yourself, and also learn what works for you. Brandon and I can talk about what works for us all day, but you have to figure out what works for you and your process, and being able to hold steady in that.
Great. So Dr. Culpepper and Professor Stuckey are going to pass the mic around, and while they're doing that, it's also a good time for a plug for Tulsa Review, right? Our Tulsa Community College literary magazine, yes, right? I'm sensing some Tulsa Review staff members over here. Submissions are going to be
March 1st.
March 1st, so have some things ready, and maybe put some of those things into practice. But who's got questions for our panelists? Don't be shy.
Yeah, I have a question for both Brandon and Robin. Did you struggle with the details for the characters, and how did you, acquire certain details for these characters?
For me, I did an incredible amount of very personal research. I interviewed a lot of families. I talked to foster parents, foster kids, foster parents who adopted. I talked to friends who had been adopted and had a terrible experience. I talked to friends who had been adopted and had a wonderful experience. I talked to birth mothers, a woman who worked as a liaison between birth mothers and adoptive families, just everyone I could. If I heard you were adopted or had adopted, and within that 6-month period, I'd probably talk to you. And as far as discovering the characters, I mean, you can do as much research as you want, but you have to make sure the characters are themselves. And for me, a lot of that is just sitting down and seeing what's going to happen, just seeing what these characters are going to do and where they're going to go and who's going to walk into the room. And I always say it's like spending time with a friend. If there's a friend you see once a year, you're not going to have that same relationship as the friend you see every day. You're not going to have those sort of intimacies with them. So for me, it's sort of about sitting down as much as possible, thinking about the characters, seeing what they have to say and being able to listen to them. And I always say this, and my mom's like, what do you mean all the characters are in your head? What are you talking about? But, you have to respect them as people, even though they are imaginary. And I think that's what sort of adds hopefully, ideally, the three-dimensionality to the book.
What she said, right? No, for this book, I spent a lot of time thinking about my time when I was a social worker, and thinking about the specific details. I remember the things that were said, the things that certain kids did, and so a lot of that. I took a lot of notes and wrote a lot of that down before I started writing it. But Robin's right. It's ultimately seeing what happens, having the idea of the character in mind, right? And I think it's a lot like acting, at least. And again, I said this last night, but I'm not theatrical in any way. But I imagine that if you act, you really have to get inside the head of a character, right, to convince the audience that you are who this character is. I think it's that's a lot like, at least from a first person point of view, where you're getting inside the head of a character, which is fun, right? I mean, part of it should be fun. I think the drafting, stage. So, yeah.
Good. Do we have a question back here? No? And then we have someone up here as well.
Yes, my question is, how heavily do you rely on blogs or social media to spread the word about your books?
Marketing.
For me, YA is so based in social media. I constantly try to figure out how much of myself do I want to put out there in terms of talking about my books. In terms of sales, I don't feel that it moves the needle very much, but I think in terms of building a community, I think it's really important. It helps me. Writing is so lonely sometimes. It's so frustrating. Being able to reach out to another author on Twitter and just have like a laugh or a moment about the ridiculousness of our jobs sometimes is really, really nice. Honestly, all I can do is write the book and try to put it out in the world. And after it leaves, I have no control over it anymore, and I can't control how other people react to it. I've learned that lesson over 10 years. And I love seeing people talk about it on social media. I love when people tag me in very nice things. Sometimes it's not very nice things. And it's just all part of the experience. That's part of being a writer, is being able to watch other people talk about your book and realize it has nothing to do with you. Yeah.
I think the same thing. I mean, social media is. The only reason I think that I'm on Facebook is for the most part, to try to build this community. It's been a long time, so a lot of my friends on Facebook or the people I follow, I guess, on Twitter are part of that community. So it feels very weird, because you're saying, here is my story that appeared in the Tulsa Review or whatever journal, right? And but what you're really trying to do is try to reach out to, in some way, build the community of of readers, and sometimes that leads to good things. They might say, they might reach out to you and, hey, I saw that you published here, or you're, so they might invite you to be part of their reading group or their writing group or something. So I think that community certainly is a big part of that for social media. Yeah.
Be you. Nope.
Oh.
All right, I think I turned it off. Is this? I know you said that you had written 6 books, and I'm not sure on how many you had written, but is this style, the narrative, kind of first person, pretty common with both of you?
Brandon, do you want to
Oh, sure.
take that first?
Yeah. Well, for me, I find it more comfortable to write prose in first person because it feels more confessional, right? And it also is a closer. As a reader, I feel there's you feel closer to a first, or I do. I shouldn't say you. As a reader, I sometimes feel that confession of a first person narrator, that a third person, he or she, it feels a lot more distant, right? So in that respect, I think from this book being told from someone. Looking back, I feel like first person was the only way that I could do it well, or hope to do it well. Not to say that third person wouldn't work, but I guess I favor, first person a little bit. Yeah. What about you?
And for me, Far From the Tree is actually the first book that I haven't written in first person. All my other books are in first person. The problem was the book was originally going to be narrated first person, all from Grace's perspective. And of course, around page 100, it blew up spectacularly. And I realized that Grace cannot tell everybody's story. And like we talked about earlier, all these characters have secrets. And the narrator sometimes is very unreliable. Like Grace was so glib. She was so... you couldn't access any of this pain or grief that she was feeling, and Joaquin was giving me nothing, in first person because he doesn't want to give away anything. And I realized that if I put it into third person, I could sort of circumvent all of their secrets, and suddenly the narrator, for lack of a better word, is not them. And so I can access what they're feeling and what's happened to them in a much easier way. And the second I switched it to third person, the book wrote itself almost. Like I felt like I was channeling. So I don't know what the next book, but it's definitely made me a little bit braver to try a different, perspective.
Good. George? Nope.
Maybe at the bottom.
To the bottom, yeah.
Okay, here we go. Robin and Brandon, this is a question that's for both of you. Robin, you had mentioned your relationship with National Public Radio, and that's kind of how I started this. Is I became introduced to David Whyte, a poet and a philosopher, and I'm reading his book Consolations, which is about words and the meaning of words. And there are words or phrases that each of you said that I thought were interesting, and I'd like to hear your description or definitions of those words, perhaps in relation to your texts or to your books. Robin, you said found families. Mm-hmm. What would your definition of found families be?
I think for me, found families are the people that come into your life that, whether biologically related or not, are the people who protect you and comfort you and support you and encourage you the way that family should. And, we're not all fortunate to be born into an experience where you get that 100% of the time. And I think if you can create that within your own community and use that to move forward and move through your life, that to me is what found family is sort of creating a gathering of people and finding those people that can provide that for you. Yeah, and I think, I think that's an incredibly valid family structure.
All right, thank you. And what would your definition be of identity?
Mine?
Yes.
Or mine. Okay. Identity. Well, in terms of this book, I think that's the big question for Sequoia is that he's asking. Well, I think there are two big questions that he's asking. The first is, what is home or family? The second is, what is my identity? Is it what others are telling me it is, or is it what I discover for myself? And so Sequoia is trying to find that identity, and he feels like he's sort of pushing boundaries, right? To sneaking into Rosemary's closet to look at her clothes, right? Asking questions about his native identity. And that feels like a very, very important question to me, that is not being addressed enough maybe in literature, right? I mean, I think it is being addressed, but again, we're in 2019, and it seems like people still aren't completely comfortable, talking, especially when we're talking about that. That's a very, very important time at 14 or 15, certainly for boys and girls, I think, of trying to discover, pushing through the stereotype, right? So, those were all questions, and I'm doing the teacher job of not answering the question and just rambling on that I do in class a lot, but so I don't know that I have an answer that's directly related to what is identity, but for Sequoia, I mean, maybe I'm trying to discover. I was trying to discover that when I was writing it, because I knew that he wanted to discover it, right? And does he ever, right? That becomes, the area that I was sort of trying to point to. Does that make? That's okay.
Good.
All right.
Probably have time for one more question.
Yeah. This question's a little more for Brandon, but you mentioned how, schools in 1989 obviously were very closed-minded towards people, experimenting with their gender.
Oh, there you are. Sorry. I was looking around like, where's that? Yeah, okay, there you are. Sorry, yeah. Okay.
But I can say now, especially in Oklahoma, even in 2019, schools are very closed to that. And I think a lot of that is because teachers and staff and students are very closed-minded. So how do you think we can go about the schools being more open to people experimenting with their gender?
I think by engaging in a conversation about it, that's the only thing I think that where we can start. Because we should accept everyone certainly in the classroom, right? So I hope that teachers are wanting to have. I like to have conversations, and again, I teach at NOC in Tonkawa, but often when we read something in one of my English classes, I try to have a very open discussion, and I know that a lot of students, it really takes a lot to get them just to talk about it. So I mean, I'm totally with you on that. I don't know if maybe starting younger to just, letting kids know that it's okay to ask questions, and to have a conversation without getting, to think for themselves. And I think, that's one thing that this was what I try to, for my kids. I want them to think for themselves, not what I think, but for them to, and of course at 5 years old, but when you get to be, I think when you get to be a teenager, you can form an opinion about something, right? So whether that has to do with political questions, religion, culture, anything, I think just it's okay to question, right? So and it's a good thing. I think it's good to question, to help you come up with. So I just think maybe there should be more conversations happening, I think, in schools, and not just saying, here's the material, we're going to take a test. Mm-hmm. Here's the material, we're going to take a test. Here's the material, we're going to take a test. All right. Let's read and have have a conversation about how does this make us feel? What questions do we have? Do we think we agree with it? It's okay if you disagree with it, right? Nobody's gonna, so I think that's a good place to start. I don't know, but I think you're right. It's 2019, and we should be further along in talking about these things.
Robin, you've got the last word.
I certainly can't speak to the situation in Oklahoma, but last year I did an incredible amount of travel for Far From the Tree, and I did a lot of book festivals that were geared towards adults and a lot of book festivals geared towards teenagers. And the thing that I noticed at the younger book festivals, for the younger audience, I should say, was that my name badge has my pronouns on it. And it says she, her, he, him, they, them. And for me, that is so, 2 years ago, I was not thinking about that. And now I am so conscious of the pronouns that I use. And I make very sure to say, hi, I'm he, I'm she, her. Just so other people, if they need to tell me, I try to open the conversation because I'm around teenagers. And I think as an adult, it's up to me to be able to lead that conversation so they feel comfortable responding to me. And so if there's something I can do now to do that, I'm happy to do it. And, that's not happening at the adult book festivals, and I'll try to write it in on my name badge, or if during the introduction when I'm introducing myself I say it. And I think that's one small thing, and it's certainly something that was not happening 3-4 years ago in all these book festivals. So that gives me a little bit of hope to see the younger audience taking control in that manner. Yeah.
Well, we are out of time, but our guests are going to be able to maybe have a few minutes to maybe sign some autographs, answer some questions. So if you would, let's wrap things up. Please help me give a warm round of applause again to Brandon Hobson and Robin Benway. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks again for coming, everyone. Eat the leftover pizza. Thanks, panelists. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Those were